All right, it looks like we are live. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be covering Portland and the Department of Homeland Security. I think it's fair to call what Trump's going with Portland and the DHS sort of a Gestapo situation, but I'm sure that many would disagree. Before we get into it, some preliminaries for folks who may be new here. You'll notice to the right of your screen, there is live chat. We encourage folks to be involved in the live chat, to participate. We have very few rules. You can, we don't censor for ideology or what have you. What we do require is that you be polite to each other. Logo Cool Extreme is our moderator, volunteering once again. And he will basically warn you if you start being abusive to other people in the chat or just sort of generally disrupting the chat. And then if you ignore him, he will block you. So please pay attention to Logo Cool Extreme. The way this works is I've got a presentation. I don't know, I've got a lot written on my paper here. It could be a half hour. It could be 45 minutes. It could be as much of an hour. I'm a little pissed off about this one. So who knows? It could get ranty. At the end of the first hour, I will go into Q&A. So if you have questions that you ask while I'm doing the presentation, I'd suggest that you ask them again once I start. I don't have the mental bandwidth to sort of jump back and forth between my presentation and the chat and the questions. I have historically had trouble with internet in this house before, but I have purchased an Ethernet cable. I am, plugged in, ready to go. So hopefully we shouldn't have too many problems. If it breaks up during the presentation, I'll probably just do a new live chat. If it breaks up during the Q&A, then maybe I'll do another Q&A at some later date. All right, with that, I think I've covered everything. Excited to get started on this topic. So I think first is like a preliminary thing. I think I should mention sort of an oddity about the United States that makes me so angry about what Donald Trump is doing right now in Portland, Oregon, what he tried to do in Washington, D.C. about a month ago, and what it looks like he'll be attempting to roll out to a number of other cities and states. In most countries, most developed countries, there's a more direct line between law enforcement and the federal central government. I mean, it varies from place to place. I don't want to say it again, but I think largely most countries have a more direct line between law enforcement and the central government than the United States does. It's something that's very unique about the way that the United States works. So that might be a little confusing for some of my international folks who are wondering why I'm so incensed about the fact that, the president is getting involved in local law enforcement. It's a contrast because those who follow the channel know that I've been complaining a lot about how hyper-fragmented law enforcement is in the United States. However, if you go back and look at that video, you'll note that what I was calling for was a little more centralization at the state level, not at the federal level. You can say whether it's good or bad, but as an American and actually traditionally a more conservative and libertarian leaning American, I think it's very valuable to, U.S. citizen. I need to, everyone in all the Americas are Americans. I need to not do that, U.S. citizen. But as a U.S. citizen, I believe that it is very central to my country that we have a system of federalism and that the federal government is distinct from the local governments and that local governments have power. That's very important to me. As a U.S. citizen, as someone who's traditionally leaned somewhat conservative, somewhat libertarian. So that's why what is happening is so outrageous. So I think there are a number of things in the U.S. media sort of world that get blown out of proportion. This happens on all political sides. There's, I find it kind of frustrating the way that, almost everything Donald Trump does is portrayed as this, death of the republic, yada, yada, yada thing by folks on the left, and folks on the right do this as well. The fact that Barack Obama, a president I had a lot of quibbles with, but is, I think pretty universally agreed by sensible people to be like the most scandal-free president since Jimmy Carter. That guy is somehow, portrayed as like corrupt and a demon. So like on both sides, there's a lot of horse shit. But I gotta say, one that has been extraordinarily extreme and is on the fault of the more right-leaning marketing segmentation over the past 6 months is this idea that U.S. cities are dissolving into chaos. There's, dogs are sleeping with cats and things are on fire, and the end times are here. It's all insane. That's actually not something that's happening in the United States right now. I have been actually in countries where things have begun to get out of control. One of the reasons I, sort of started doing this YouTube channel professionally was because I got mixed up in the Gezi Park uprising in Turkey in 2013. And what happened there was protesters took over the central square of Turkey and took over one of the transit hubs, not just for the city of Istanbul, a city of 15 million people, but the entire country. And they legitimately occupied this center of the city, equivalent to really Times Square in the United States, and honestly, nothing else in the United States. Now that was truly things, getting a little out of control and protesters taking over a real section of a city. That simply isn't happening in the United States, with one glaring exception that has already been resolved that I will talk about. The fact is, U.S. cities are more spread out. That's why I've actually been kind of surprised over the past 6 months, 3 to 6 months. Well, I guess really, gosh, it's only 2 months really since this stuff kicked off at the end of May and the beginning of June. But I've been surprised actually at how effective this sort of mass uprising approach has been, because it always just sort of struck me that with the United States, with car culture, with the fact that we have all of these different cities of, obviously some mega cities are more important than others, but even those cities, they're all very spread out. We don't really go in for central downtowns in the United States so much. I mean, they exist, but they're not that important. I really didn't think it was possible for a protest movement to reach the kind of critical mass necessary to truly influence the country. And I was wrong about that. I've seen that over the past 2 months. But what we're not seeing, and what Fox News is pretending we are seeing, is real deal no shit insurrection. There were people on Fox News yesterday, including Tom fucking Cotton, actually comparing protesters, largely peaceful protesters, to full-on 1861, Southern Confederate insurrectionists, like trying to secede. And that's insane. I do want to say mostly peaceful protesters. Like, there are some violent protesters. The way things work in certain Western cities are honestly probably a little different from the way I would like things to work. As a East Coaster, there's a culture of protest, sort of anarchist protest, kind of throwing things at cops. And you know what? Like, if you're a protester throwing a Molotov cocktail, or rocks, or even frozen water bottles at police officers, yes, you should be arrested. I'm perfectly all right with that. But that's not really the issue here. That's not the issue that we're dealing with. What Donald Trump is doing in Portland, because there are police in Portland. There's a whole culture of policing that's apparently, according to some folks, fairly right-wing in Portland. And these cops do battle with these protesters. It's something that isn't just a this year thing. It's been something that's been going on for quite some time. Regardless, the police in Portland, Seattle, while I am sure there are many reasons to quibble with their approach to protesters from a civil rights, civil liberties standpoint, these cities do have peace officers, do have law enforcement of their own that are handling the situation the way that they see fit, and the way that elected officials in these cities and states see fit. And that is the way things are supposed to work. I will say that, like, Portland, like, honestly, like, if I were living in Portland, I would, I sort of describe myself as a conservative, and I actually, believe that I, am a conservative, but I find myself more and more, especially in the Trump administration, sort of reflexively siding with liberals and even some left-wing folks. The fact that Donald Trump was elected president is a radicalizing thing for people who read books and know history. But if I lived in Portland, I'd probably be like, I mean, I don't know, like, I don't know if I'd go this far, but I'd probably be more sympathetic to law enforcement in Portland. I'd probably, want the mayor and the other elected officials in Portland to do more. But you know what? I don't live in Portland. Tucker Carlson, the people who work at Fox News do not live in Portland. The people who live in Portland and who elect political figures in Portland, in Oregon, have the right to decide what happens in Portland. The president can't just sort of decide that it's politically viable and send in his secret police. And that is, in effect, what he's done. It's obviously much more bumbling than that. It's a bunch of, famously, the not all of them, because the Department of Homeland Security, as we'll get into, is a fantastically complex and weird entity that has only been cobbled together over the past 20 years. But the specific people, the specific slices of the Department of Homeland Security that are being used as these secret police are pretty well known to be the absolute bottom of the barrel. The people who work for Border Patrol, the Customs and Border Protection, ICE, oh God, I've forgotten what ICE stands for. These people are the folks who couldn't get hired at your local police department. These are the folks who obviously couldn't get into the US military. These are people who, are the bottom of the barrel. And I think that's another problem, that we basically have just hired too many law enforcement people since 9/11. So we're sort of running out of capable, competent people. So these folks that are being dumped in, I mean, it's like the folks from the Bureau of Prisons who are asked to be doing riot control. It is folks from ICE, folks from Customs and Border Protection. Interestingly, that's the service that seems to be doing the most stuff in Portland, which makes zero sense. Customs and Border Protection should not be acting to defend federal property. And that's the justification that they point to here, that Trump dumping all these federal forces into Portland, the justification is that a courthouse is being attacked or other federal property is being attacked. And you know what? Like, I mean, it is. That's not inaccurate. And I think that the federal government as well, I actually think there's a distinct service for protecting federal property. And the federal government is well within its rights to protect a courthouse that is being attacked. Again, there is this culture in, I think, a few Western cities, Portland, Seattle to a lesser degree, I think Oakland, the sort of larger, I think it's a larger city than San Francisco, but it's part of the sort of San Francisco metro area. These cities do have this culture of sort of, anarchist stuff, graffiti everywhere. It's weirdly, much like the Department of Homeland Security, actually, it's something I associate with being weirdly European. I remember visiting Athens in, 2012, 2013, and just sort of being just aghast walking around the streets, just how graffiti was covering everything as Greece was going through its own sort of uprising thing. And that's sort of what's happening in certain areas in Portland. However, it's not what's happening to this courthouse, what's happening to these federal properties is not something that raises to the level of needing to send in the Gestapo. It's not to the point where the president should have unmarked police forces from the federal government, from other places in the country, driving around in minivans, throwing people into cars. There's no reason to do that to protect the federal courthouse. As an indicator of this, the U.S. attorney, basically the Oregon legal infrastructure is doing everything it can to try to save its constitutional rights as a state against this federal invasion. And apparently the U.S. attorney, the guy who does a lot of work in that federal courthouse, is also looking to open cases against Trump and the Department of Homeland Security for doing this. So the actual federal workers who work in that federal courthouse think that what Trump is doing here is inappropriate and insane. Another thing worth pointing out, Portland as well is, it's a U.S. city. There's a downtown area. I've been there. Remember some weird public sculpture in the building. Anyway, a lot of good donuts and strip clubs. It's sort of what Portland's known for. This It's a U.S. city. It's very spread out. What my understanding is that what is happening, these sort of running battles between Trump's Gestapo and anarchist protesters are happening in like a block or two of Portland. There's just not, I mean, it's not like the life of this city is being impacted in any real significant way. What's being impacted, what is impacting life in Portland in a very serious, significant way is the coronavirus disaster that Donald Trump has done nothing to prevent, which is, of course, what all of this is really about. He's trying desperately to find something to distract, not just, well, at this point, anybody, to distract the country and certainly his own supporters from the coronavirus disaster that he has allowed to happen. So I think that's just really important. Like if you're watching Fox News and you're hearing about how crazy and scary this uprising is, you're being lied to. I think Fox even now has conceded the point, pay attention during those Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity segments, because they now have to, I think they've been guilted into putting dates on the riot footage. There were about 3 days of riots nationwide, maybe a week, depending on the city, between the very end of May and the very beginning of June. Other than these weird Western cities with that culture of anarchism, it's over. It's just not happening anywhere. Something you may not know watching Fox News, Seattle had an actual attempt to occupy like sort of a Gezi type experience, except it wasn't like the Times Square of Seattle. It was, my understanding is that the Capitol Hill area is sort of an underprivileged sector that basically attempted to ban police officers from coming in anymore. And that was called the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the Capitol Hill, I think there's another acronym, there's CHAZ and then there's CHOP. Not exactly sure what that stands for. This was, I mean, Fox News wanted to talk about this all the time. Trump supporters want to talk about this all the time. They're losing control of Seattle. And, Trump would make tweets ordering the Seattle mayor to close down this autonomous region. If they didn't do it, then he'd step in. First off, he has no right to do that under the Constitution. Seattle, Portland, these places can make their own decisions. They have their own law enforcement. They have their own politics. They have their own politicians. The idea that Trump can sort of order that sort of thing is reprehensible. But I kind of wonder, I mean, I don't watch Fox News religiously. I wonder if they've even bothered to tell you that the whole CHAZ experience, that Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, that no-go zone that was created and trumpeted so much on Fox News and in conservative media, it's over. It's gone. Some people got shot, and the Seattle mayor sent in the Seattle police. No problem. And that's the story. Maybe they should have gone in earlier. I don't know. That's the business of Seattle politicians and Seattle voters. That is not the business of Tucker Carlson, Fox News, Sean Hannity, and the president of the fucking United States. Excuse my language. It just gets angry making. So yes. I mean, also about Portland specifically, like there's a TV show, a long-running TV show about how weird, hippie, and liberal Portland is. I mean, it's a kind of nutso place, and the culture of anarchism and dumbass combat between anarchists and redneck cops. It's just as much a part of the Portland character as donuts and strip clubs. And the idea that the president can weaponize this and basically create an entirely new set of rights and law enforcement possibilities is frankly, it's insane, and it should be deeply disturbing to any real conservative, any real libertarian. And it's interesting because there are, I think that's a lot of folks on the left have been like, where are the libertarians at? They should be talking about this. And my understanding is like a lot of libertarian thinkers have been focusing on this. A lot of libertarian think tank types have been focusing on this, have been alarmed by this, have been writing about this. What is embarrassing is that a lot of libertarian politicians thinking about Mike Lee of Utah, Rand Paul of Kentucky, have been real slow on condemning this horse shit. Rand Paul finally, I believe, started tweeting about it yesterday against what Trump is doing. So it is a little. I think the idea that libertarian thinkers, agitators, think tankers haven't been talking about this, I think that's unfair. I think that's a slur. However, the fact that supposedly libertarian-leaning politicians, Republican politicians in the House and the Senate, they absolutely have been slow rolling their opposition to this, and that is embarrassing. Rand Paul, once again, has lost a lot of respect from me in his sort of obeisance to Donald Trump. I mean, finally, he's speaking up now. But, all right. Okay. Jesus. So that's 2 of 8 I'm on. Let's see. What do we got? Number 3. Okay. So specifically getting a little bit more into the Department of Homeland Security. What's really troubling aspect of this. The Department of Homeland Security is a new thing. It is a novel thing. I would argue that it is an un-American thing. It's essentially a European-style Ministry of the Interior that controls law enforcement. That is not the way that the United States is supposed to work. It works fine for other countries, but this is not the way the United States is supposed to work. The United States is not supposed to have sort of Ministry of the Interior that has a million different duties and oversees law enforcement and can send thugs into any state or city in the country to break heads. That's not the way the United States is supposed to work. But even worse than that, the fact that the people who are running these agencies aren't even there under the legal requirements that have been set down. I believe that sort of the existence of the Department of Homeland Security is a sort of constitutional mistake. It's not something that should have happened. It was a bad idea. However, if we have to have a Department of Homeland Security, then some of the basics about its legal existence should be observed. Chad Wolf, this somewhat ridiculously named and almost completely inexperienced acting head of the Department of Homeland Security, has not been, oh God, I've forgotten the word, has not been approved by the US Senate. He does not have a real position there. He's an acting head. These things happen, there's political vagaries, it takes a while. The important thing to remember here is that the Senate, the part of the US government, the part of the US legislature that approves nominations to these offices, is still completely controlled by the Republicans. So Chad Wolf, for quite some time, has been an acting head of the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security has a number of agencies under it. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, probably administration. ICE, CBP, I think the Border Patrol is under them. Don't quote me on that. But basically 22 separate agencies were aggregated under the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 and 2003. The Coast Guard is under the Department of Homeland Security, which I'm sure the Coast Guard hates. So Chad Wolf, the overarching head of the Department of Homeland Security, is acting. He has not been approved by the US legislature. Going down to Mark A. Morgan, the head of the Customs and Border Protection, has not been approved by the US legislature as he is supposed to. Matthew Albence, the acting head of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, yes, that's what ICE stands for, has not been approved by the US Congress as he should be. All of these folks are apparently so toxic that they can't even be approved by the Republican Senate. That's really troubling. And this is a troubling thing that happens throughout the Trump administration. Donald Trump is, in a lot of cases, simply too lazy to appoint people to a lot of positions. But these law enforcement capabilities, this ability to provide a sort of Gestapo, a secret police for the president, this sort of thing he is interested in. And he's not interested in having a person in these key roles that is actually capable of being approved by a House of Congress filled with Republicans. I mean, he requires that these people be more corrupt than the Republican Party can stand. And that's really, really troubling. What's interesting, sort of looking at these people, the more you look at it, the sillier it looks. These people, I mean, Chad Wolf in particular is just an absolute caricature of. I mean, his name is Chad Wolf. There's a big picture of him on Twitter, like in like helicopter oversight gear. Of course, he's never actually served in any real capacity militarily. He's loves to go on cable news and talk tough and talk nonsensically. These people are, and Trump himself. I mean, they're comical. They're ridiculous. And this may seem a little extreme, though, but I think it's important to remember, like, Mussolini and Hermann Goring. I mean, these people were ridiculous-looking people. They're just stupid. Fat, stupid, cosplaying militarist dipshits. But you know what? Like, when they got into power, they still killed a lot of people. And we're not there yet. The United States, is not. There's a classic line that fascism is forever descending on the United States, but only ever seems to land in Europe. Well, that's a great joke that I was happy making before 2016. But this is screwed up. This Department of Homeland Security that was created in the aftermath of 9/11, and now just 16 years later, it's devolving in another way. It's got all these folks who have not been approved by Congress running around doing things that they really shouldn't be doing. The legislative ability to act in these ways is not at all clear. It's a real problem. We basically have unaccountable secret police forces running rampant all over the country. That's bad. And also, it's just the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, CBP. Just sort of a side note, I wanted to talk about Mark A. Morgan. So Mark Morgan is a guy who had a career in the sort of border forces or what have you. And what's interesting, so he's sort of really negatively distinguished himself over the past couple of days by saying, "Oh yeah, our guys can't. It's totally fine that our guys have no badge numbers and no names on their uniforms because." Because they'll be in danger. It'll put their lives in danger. I mean, that's just. I mean, I remember like as a kid watching the news from Italy. I think specifically because Italy, was it the years of lead had a lot of problems. Italy and actually, yeah, a lot of Arab countries. This idea that the security services had to go masked. Otherwise, their lives would be in danger. I think it's obviously a component in Mexico. This has never been a component in the United States. And the idea that this is a real problem in the United States says something really dark and fucked up about the way our culture is developing. And you know what? It ain't the protesters. There's no justification for this. There's no justification for this. It's that is like Mark A. Morgan, this guy who's saying, "Oh yeah, it's perfectly fine for safety reasons for our officers to have no accountability and be masked." And basically, it can't express to you how much it chills. It's chilling and enraging. It ain't good, folks. But anyway, so this Mark A. Morgan guy, this is an interesting just sort of description of the trajectory of these services over the past 4 or 5 years, and the way that. Being associated with the culture of these organizations, the way that they are currently organized is so corrupting. So Mark A. Morgan was an Obama appointee. Now, what's happened is he shuffled between a number of services, but he was initially appointed and approved by Congress by Obama. And there was some interesting. I was just reading glancing over his Wikipedia profile. He apparently got in some trouble with the Border Patrol Union when he was heading the Border Patrol because he said he wanted immigration reform. He wanted like actual rules to cover how these things happen. And that's not in the interest of the Border Patrol. So he was very unpopular with the Border Patrol. And apparently, I don't know if he was still with the Border Patrol or if he was with somebody else. When Trump came to power, he was run out of whatever office he was in. So he learned that what he had to do to get along, not just with Trump, but with the people in his own organization, was to get more rabidly stupid, basically, to get more stupid and to get more authoritarian. That's the kind of thing that Trump is encouraging. That's the kind of thing that the very culture of the Department of Homeland Security encourages. He's got, there's quotes of him talking about how you can look into the eyes of a child and see that he's really a member of MS-13, and talking about how we need to have security forces, masked near vigilante security forces in the United States. It's pretty fucked up the way things are developing, and is, I think, just another more personal aspect of building to my final argument, which is that we should dismantle the Department of Homeland Security. So my next point, this is, I think, very likely to backfire. What Trump is doing here is he's sort of doubling down for his base, trying to get people excited. I think Trump has been very warped by the fact that he got to run against Hillary Clinton, who was a historically unpopular candidate for president. So he thought all he had to do was, do a big. All he had to do was do a big. What's the word? All he had to do was cultivate his base, and that's all he needed to win. That's not what he needs to do against Biden, a person that people legitimately seem to not mind. I don't know if they really like him, but they don't hate him. And people hate Trump. That's the really key thing coming up in this election. So I think that this whole process is backfiring. I think Portland, and this is a dynamic I saw in Gezi. What was very good for the government in Turkey was that, for the first weeks when there were millions of people on the streets of Istanbul and cities all over Turkey, there wasn't really much they could do other than just sort of sit back and give ground or whatnot. As time went on, as people were well, we'd like our functioning economy back, we'd like to have the transit hub of the city working again, things sort of boiled down to more and more dead enders. The protesters on the streets got more violent. The protesters on the streets, were more interested in sort of niche political things than the sort of overarching issues that had gotten people to the streets. And that had happened in Portland. I think the people who had made a point of going out and battling with the police every night were probably pretty unattractive people in Portland. I think they had gotten down to the point where there were sort of dozens or maybe 100, a couple hundred folks a night in a very small part of town. Thanks to Trump's deciding to unleash the Gestapo, we've now got thousands on the streets of Portland again. If I were living in Portland, I probably, as I said, I probably wouldn't have liked the anarchists on the streets, but I absolutely would be marching against the idea of masked people masked federal agents throwing people into minivans. I'm sure as fuck be marching against that. So it's backfiring in Portland. It's backfiring in national politics. It's becoming enough of an issue that people like me can rant about it for an hour. And I don't think it's gonna work in the short term. This sort of authoritarian shit. This is exactly what he pulled in DC about a month ago, and that was the point at which his polls tanked. I think most folks in the U.S. should remember. Basically, there were a bunch of peaceful protesters. I know there were peaceful protesters because some of my friends were there outside the White House. And he basically, with a bunch of Federal Bureau of Prisons and I think Customs and Border Protection people again, with a bunch of weird federal paramilitary dipshits who are supposed to be doing other things, attacked that crowd, pushed them off the street so he could do a tough-looking walk to a church with a Bible. And that is the point at which his approval ratings and his stacking up in polls against Biden tanked. It just fell off a cliff. So no, I do not think that this thing is going to work here. But I think Trump believes, I think he's wrong. I think Trump believes that picking this fight, not just with the folks in Portland, but with mayors in Chicago, Seattle, other places, will be good for him. And I think he's wrong. I think it may be good for his base. It may be good for the the geriatric media, Fox News types. But I don't think it's good in general. I think it's a waste. I think he's going to lose. However, just because this isn't going to help Trump doesn't mean it's something that we shouldn't be seriously concerned about, because these problems are not going to go away. The fact is, like any government agency, What happens when a government agency has a problem is they want to perpetuate it. They want to more money to be spent on dealing with it. So what we've created in the Department of Homeland Security, because it is very weighted. Again, I don't want to paint with too broad brush. There, the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, very well-defined agencies that do good work that is worthwhile, are under the Department of Homeland Security as well, and I'm sure they're pretty embarrassed of what's going on right now. However, like Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration Customs Enforcement, DHS, the broader culture of this thing is becoming a very sort of immigration enforcement, law enforcement should be able to do whatever it wants, stop any brown person, stop any protest, do whatever it wants because, of who it is. Like that culture is going to continue to exist. The problem of the United States having a sort of new Ministry of the Interior that can go and do secret police shit anywhere in the country, the fact that that exists remains a very bad thing. And it's going to be a real problem. I think that, the whole idea that Donald Trump, we have to be worried about, okay, Donald Trump's a fascist. We have to be worried about next time when we'll get a competent fascist. I think that might be a little overblown. I think that, figures like Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley really aren't as legitimately popular as a lot of liberal and left media like to imagine. But I do think that generally, this DHS mess could be abused by a Democratic president, could be abused by, if the Department of Homeland Security exists, it's been around for 2 decades. If it continues to exist, look at how shitty it's gotten in just the past 2 decades. I think we're probably at a point right now where we kind of have to get rid of it, because if we don't get rid of it, it's going to be immortal. It's going to be here forever. And it's like, if I'm re-listening to the history of Rome, and I think comparisons to Rome are overblown, but it's like the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard made sense under Augustus. Of course, the emperor should be protected. That's a great thing. And within 40 or 50 years, or certainly within 100 years, the Praetorian, I think within a decade or two, the Praetorian Guard was murdering emperors to set up their own, was driving the entire empire into civil war. And I think that's what we've got shaping up with the Department of Homeland Security. Look, a Ministry of the Interior, Department of Homeland Security type institution can be well organized. I think, they've got that in Britain, the Home Office, and then there's Scotland Yards under the Home Office. Is that sort of how all that works? I'm not as up on that as I was a year ago. But the Department of Homeland Security has been a fucking disaster. And it has been organized in ways that have led to disaster and continuing disaster and growing disaster. So I think it's worth pointing out that, I think I've already sort of started talking about this. Yeah, you can do a Ministry of Interior and it can work. I don't believe it should in the United States. I think it's against our constitutional, it's against our character as a country. But, you could have done it well. The Department of Homeland Security has not been done well. It's a Frankenstein thing. There's an article that I linked in the description here that I endorse completely, and I think everybody should read. It talks in a little more detail about how it's just a corrupt mess. I should have mentioned the whole kids in cages, the whole brutal enforcement of immigration stuff under Trump and Obama. That's the Department of Homeland Security as well. Because it's such a mess, because it's so poorly organized, these agencies like ICE, CBP, Border Patrol are free to just sort of go and set their own policies because, there's nobody really overseeing them, except for, in this case, acting Secretary Chad Wolf, who, is all in for the most brutal interpretations of what all these agencies should be doing. So the DHS, it's interesting. It's worth just going to the Wikipedia page because it's an insane breadth of stuff that the Department of Homeland Security is supposed to cover. By the way, I noticed there's a lot of oh, don't be so Trump deranged in the comments. And we're not talking about Trump stuff here. We're talking. Do you remember Jade Helm? Do you remember there's a whole range of fears that Obama was going to, the DHS, that's what Obama's going to use. That's the internal, that's what Biden or, President Beto is going to use to come and take your guns. This Department of Homeland Security stuff isn't like a Trump or a anti-Trump or pro-Trump thing. It's a real problem with the way that our country is organized that needs to be dealt with. I think there's a lot of stuff under DHS that just doesn't need to exist at all, but that's not what I'm really proposing today. I'm proposing simply the Department of Homeland Security be broken up and these agencies go back to where they came from. There's already a federal law enforcement component that, I don't like. I don't like the FBI. I'm not a big fan of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but the FBI is under the Department of Justice. It is a well-established, it is a century-established institution. It's got a lot of cultural problems of its own, but it's run by lawyers. It's the Department of Justice controls the FBI. The law enforcement people are controlled by lawyers. That's good. I think that what survives of ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, this is from that article, should go back to the Department of Justice. And there are natural places for all of the Frankenstein parts of the Department of Homeland Security to go. And I think that's a really smart thing that the article linked in the description does. It points out, you've got the FBI, cultural problems. Personally, philosophically, I'm not a big fan of the FBI, but that's my hang up. But it's a law enforcement agency for the country, and it more or less works. And it hasn't gone, with very famous exceptions. It hasn't gone too far off the rails because it's controlled by lawyers. At this point, ICE, CBP, the Border Patrol is controlled by fucking nobody, other than the president, who just sort of can use it for their personal whims. Nobody, conservative, liberal, progressive, in the United States who cares about the United States Constitution should be okay with this. So yeah, I think we should definitely break up the Department of Homeland Security. There's again, getting back to that article, this is stuff that I've been concerned with. Just the Department of Homeland Security. It's just even in the article, Rumsfeld said that just doesn't sound very American. It just sort of sounds kind of German. It's not. It's linked to a sort of blood and soil nationalism idea that I don't think the United States should have. And I'm actually going to quote directly from Matthew Ford, that New Republic article. The Department of Homeland Security was a hastily assembled product of a dark, paranoid moment in U.S. history, the aftermath of 9/11, and the fact that DHS persists. As Ford argues, it sort of keeps us in that fucked up period of U.S. history. And I think if we're ever going to grow out of the war on terror, if we're ever going to grow out of, if we're going to move forward as a country and the world, I think abolishing the Department of Homeland Security, breaking it up and putting these agencies back to where they were before, I think that's a fucking-tastic idea. I think it's something that needs to happen. There's so much more I want to talk about, like the extent to which there's a great book called Top Secret America that I'm halfway through and have been for like 5 years now, that talks about just the incredible expansion of policing, national security stuff that has happened under the post 9/11 dispensation, the Department of Homeland Security, and talks about like fusion centers, this idea that this is the place where the Department of Homeland Security can coordinate with like-minded police officers, all around the country. There's a fusion center in every big city where the DHS can sort of coordinate with intelligence services and this, that, and the other thing. And I think that's largely, those have been seen as a costly boondoggle and sort of pointless, and has yielded essentially nothing. But this is what this idea of fusion centers, this is what this idea of law enforcement, federal law enforcement being everywhere, that's what this yields. This is what it was always going to yield, because it's a bad idea. It's not. It is an un-American idea. It is an unconstitutional idea, if not according to the letter of the law, certainly according to the spirit. Abolish the Department of Homeland Security. I personally have a lot of opinions about what can be done with certain components like ICE and CBP and the Border Patrol. I would definitely prefer abolishing or massively defunding those agencies as well. But fine, you don't have to. Like, the most important thing, the first step, is to get rid of DHS, and each of those agencies can go back to the oversight of saner, better established, better organized agencies like the Department of Justice or some other thing. And just one final thing. This is sort of more of a personal anecdote, but I found this, and I just found it so perfect and horrifying. So I lived in Washington, D.C. for 8 years before moving on to Istanbul and now New York City. Well, I guess now I'm in northern Michigan. But how to put this? I spent a lot of time volunteering with around the substance abuse community in Washington, D.C. and working with sort of homeless folks, folks with serious mental disorders, stuff like that. And what was interesting is, like, one of the sort of haunting things that would sort of come up that folks would discuss was St. E's. And so it was St. Elizabeth's as a mental institution set up in Washington, D.C., I believe in the 1850s, something like that. And yeah, I mean, it's funny because, volunteering in these circles throughout my 20s, I would hear a lot about, sort of older homeless men and women, or not homeless, not necessarily homeless, but, just folks who'd spent a lot of time in the system talking about St. Elizabeth's and how crazy and how dark it was. And it just was always in my head as like this like terrifying Victorian mental institution kind of image. But I think under Reagan and the years since, we've sort of stopped funding mental institutions in the United States. The default answer now is we just send crazy people to jail. They just sort of occupy beds there. So St. Elizabeth's is a much diminished institution, and it had a large federally owned campus in and around. I think it's probably Southeast Washington, D.C. So St. Elizabeth's, the Western campus of St. Elizabeth's, is now the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. And I just couldn't think of anything more appropriate than the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is headquartered in a fucking mental institution. So yeah, I thought that was a nice close. We got 60 people watching. I'm honored, grateful that 60 folks are here. This concludes the actual presentation. That's 48 minutes. I think that was a good, solid presentation. I could have been much longer, whipped my way through that. And now it is time for question and answer. Any questions that you have, I will do my best to respond. I am more likely, I will definitely respond to your question if you do it in the form of a super chat. You can donate to the channel, and I'm very much in need of your donations. If you can donate to the channel by doing a super chat, and then I will definitely answer your question. Now I will just start dealing with any questions I find here. How are things in the chat? Have we avoided too much blocking, I hope? Were there any super chats that I missed, Loga? I don't see any. All right, questions. Is it John? That sounds Irish, right? John T. Martin. Keeping up with British politics? He asks, the Tories are destroying this country even more so than before. British society is crumbling. I have not been keeping up with British politics. I thought I was reading something that said that implying that Boris Johnson had some, come to Jesus moment and was no longer pitching the Conservatives and himself as much of a asteritarian. Is that a word? But I'm sure that's bullshit. So yeah, I can't speak to that. I think what's fascinating is what I find really interesting is sort of in the sort of Brexit British politics thing is just there's a huge bailout package for hard hit European countries, and Spain and Italy are going to be benefiting from that, and Britain is not. Though honestly, in practice, I mean, I think that's a real gotcha thing for Brexiteers. Like in practice, the British would have been paying in probably more to that bailout package. Actually, if the British had still been in the EU, that bailout package probably never would have happened. So yeah, I don't know. Weird, a lot of weird optimism. I think Malta can speak to that. Is that Malta? Is it Malt? Malta Meyer in the comments. Weird optimism about the EU recently. There's hopes that this coronavirus response could actually lead to. I think the EU is taking on debt for the first time. Not sure if that's. Don't quote me on that exactly, but there are novel elements to this bailout package that was approved earlier this week. So that's some very interesting stuff. I think for the purposes of peace, history, and human benefit, I would be delighted to see the EU finally get its act together. From the perspective of a U.S. citizen who's really been benefiting from this sort of weird Fed hegemony, and the fact that there is no alternative to the US dollar, I guess it's a little terrifying that the EU might be getting its act together. But that's neither here nor there. All right. Okay. Giannis Prost, Kian. Kian, is that that's some variety of Celtic or something? I'm, hesitant to suggest that it might be Scottish or Irish because I'm sure I'd get it wrong. Kian. Okay. Thank you, Michael Hunt. Kian. All right. Logo Cool Extreme asks, who has stronger control on the Republican Party, Murdoch or McConnell? That's a very good question. I would say Murdoch for sure, because he's still got the power to drive the herds, and I think McConnell has a lot of power as well. I don't think it's necessarily should be seen as Murdoch and McConnell necessarily being at odds. I think they work together fairly closely. I mean, I don't know if they actually, hang out and smoke cigars together and like, how can we fuck up the world more today? But they are largely in tune. Multimeyer says about the EU, and like in any good democracy, nobody is really happy. Clorox Bleach says Intel Pro, COINTEL Pro. That's a CIA thing, right? Like a CIA scandal. M. Savina asks, how do you feel about the removal of statues? Like any good red-blooded American, I get a little pissed off when I see Ulysses S. Grant getting knocked over. But as far as the Confederate statues, yeah, fuck them, get rid of them. I'm cool. I'm done with it. That wasn't my position 4 years ago. I think I've talked about this before on the channel. Like Baltimore did this great thing. This is in the pre-Trump era, where they actually described what the context of the statue. They sort of put up a display and explained why it was problematic, why people were worried about it. They were sort of involved in that. And I kind of like that. I thought that was a good solution. But what Donald Trump has done is he's done with many issues is he's made he's sort of pumped it up as a huge culture war issue. So yeah, now I'm like, my opinion used to be, well, let the cities decide. Let it happen democratically. I'm certainly not in favor of, in any case, of protesters tearing down, works of public art. I don't like that. But I think that I guess I turned 40. I'm not so much into anarchy anymore. But I'm very much in support of the local governments of any municipality deciding that they no longer want these statues to represent them and getting rid of them. I'm all for it. I'm also all for taking the names of Confederate generals off of U.S. bases. That's just obvious to me, beyond obvious. And it's sort of frustrating and it's weird to me that we've had bases for 60, 70 years named after Confederate generals. And as far as those being like a big historical significance, like that nobody in the fucking 1880s wanted to name a military base after a Confederate general. And that's a really key thing that I think was new to me, though I was already pretty anti-Confederate, but I think has made the difference for a lot of people who were bothered by the idea of knocking down Confederate statues. Like these statues were not put down by, put up by, Confederate veterans. These were put up in the 1920s and 1930s at a point in time where the Ku Klux Klan had national power. Immigration was being clamped down on. It was basically, these things are monuments, not to the Civil War, but to a period of virulent white supremacy in the 1920s. So yeah, I have no interest or concern about the continued standing of any Confederate statues. I don't like the idea of going any further. Like I don't want to see any Jefferson or Washington statues getting knocked down. But you got to understand, like this is happening because Donald Trump is a divisive asshole. There would not be a single statue knocked over in this country if it weren't for, statues would be slowly disappearing as southern cities had, more consistently Democratic leadership. But there would not be a single riot knocking over, well, maybe a single, but there would not be large scale riots knocking over Confederate statues or statues of any kind if Donald Trump had not been president. If we didn't have an incompetent bully who governs by culture war as president, none of this would have happened. I don't like the idea of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson getting. I love the idea of Woodrow Wilson getting taken off the Princeton School of Government, but mostly or international affairs, mostly just because I hate Woodrow Wilson. But yeah, so I don't want Washington D.C. to get knocked down. I don't want George Washington to get knocked down. I don't want Thomas Jefferson to get knocked down. So in order to keep that from happening, we need to vote Donald Trump out of office as soon as possible. Nikhil Otar asks, "What's with the Chinese embassy?" Super chat train. Thank you, Nikhil Otar, for the super chat, and I will endeavor to answer your question. Unfortunately, I can't. The Chinese embassy news broke this morning. I believe there's a large, it's not an embassy, I believe it's a large consulate in Houston is being shut down at the order of the US government. And I don't know what the fuck's going on there. I'm not entirely sure anybody reporting on it knows what's going on there, but I didn't have the time to read any articles because I spent my morning preparing a presentation about the Department of Homeland Security. But not knowing anything has never stopped me from commenting before. Famously, yeah, that's consulates and embassies all over the world for every power are where the espionage gets done. So it's hard for me, and I think probably hard for any journalist to know what exactly is going on with this consulate in Houston. It's interesting to me. I've seen reports that after this announcement that the U.S. government wanted that consulate shut immediately. I've heard reports of people burning stuff in the backyard. Actually, now that I think about it, so like the idea that there would be enough stuff being burnt to call the fire department implies that there's a lot more going on in a consulate than maybe should be. However, every a consulate is a diplomatic outpost for a country, and they probably have diplomatic means of communication. So I do believe it would be appropriate for a Chinese consulate in Houston that's about to being shut down. It would be appropriate for them to burn things, related to communication protocols or passwords or whatnot. However, it's just like I don't know, like that's only true to an extent. Like how much burning needed to be done at the Houston consulate that was hoping to get better trade relations between Texas and Wuhan. So yeah, it's puzzling. Don't know what's going on. It's entirely possible to imagine that this is yet another example of Trump extremity and idiocy. Famously, they thought that they made this great point that, damn it, the Xinhua, I'm massacring that, but the Chinese news agency in the Trump administration thought they were making this super great point that, yeah, you know what, screw it, they're foreign agents, and the folks from that news agency have to register as foreign agents. Yeah, stick it to them. We'll brag about it in Fox News. And then the Chinese kicked out like every serious American reporter out of China. And that's not the best trade. We have an open society. People are going to report on everything. U.S. and Western reporters in China are, some of our only news sources, much more important to what we know about China than every U.S. intelligence agency. Famously, we got all our networks rolled up over there. So it's entirely possible that this is another patented Trump administration own goal, kicking themselves in the teeth issue, or it could be justified. I don't know. There is a lot of industrial espionage. I don't really know what would be so useful for. Well, actually, no. There's a lot of pharma in Texas. There's a lot of Texas is a very serious, economically developed and viable state. It's well within the realm of imagining that there was some serious industrial espionage going down in that Houston consulate, and the U.S. government completely rationally and justifiably said enough. So either interpretation could be, don't know, just don't know. More will be revealed. 69 people watching. Woohoo! I may be 40, but I'm still an infant. Judge Holden says, just dropped in. Not sure if anybody answered. I've already answered, but do you have anything to say about Michael Brooks's death? I do not. I just, this is apparently, Michael Brooks was a broadcaster with, I don't know, broadcaster, journalist, media figure. I think he was for the Majority Report with Sam Cedar, something like that. Apparently widely beloved figure on the left. I had no awareness of him prior to hearing about his death. Died unfortunately early in his early 30s. It's in his late 30s. It's as a 40-year-old, it's always disturbing to see somebody die unexpectedly in their late 30s. Normally, you'd say like an OD or something, but it seems like the only thing anybody's saying is that it was a unexpected medical issue, and that's very possible. You know, healthy-looking 37-year-olds can have heart attacks or aneurysms. It's very sad. It's strange. I listen sometimes when I'm editing. I listen to a podcast called Chapo Trap House, a bunch of dirtbag leftists who I think believe a lot of stupid shit, but are also just hilarious because what they do is they attack. Most of what they do is attack people writing stupid op-eds in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So it's a really fun podcast. I enjoy it a lot. And it's very sarcastic and has respect for nothing. And, you know, did a whole podcast pissing on John McCain's grave. But there was a 15-minute ode to my last-minute ode to Michael Brooks, you know, where these four, you know, vicious, don't care about anything podcasters were all like practically crying, talking about Michael Brooks. So he's apparently a much beloved, much missed person, and it's a real shame, and sucks when people that young die. Maybe, you know, we should have better health systems so that doesn't happen, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I'd never been aware of Michael Brooks before his unfortunate and early demise, so I don't have much to say about it. All right. Questions. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of folks here are aware of Michael Brooks. I'm feeling, I feel like I've missed something. Questions. Arrow Zero asks, More Freedom Foundation, do you believe the Republican and Democratic parties have too much power for the public to change them? Is it possible for them to split into populist establishment parties? I think I spent a lot of time advocating for third party. You know, when I started doing this channel full time, I intended it to be a full-time like third party advocacy channel. But then Donald Trump got nominated. And even when I wanted it to be a third party advocacy channel, I didn't really foresee the Democrats and Republicans being dethroned. I foresaw what happened with Ross Perot. You get a third party insurgent that gets 15-20% of the vote, and then the other parties, you know, grab all their issues. And that's how you bring about change. I think the system that I was talking about in the presentation, the federalist system in the United States, I think there are aspects to the way that the system is set up in the United States that just make it structurally harder to do third parties. There have been other party systems. Many people can argue that even though we've had Republicans and Democrats since 1860, there's been multiple party systems within those things. You know, the Republicans and Democrats have switched sides on many issues. Some they haven't. But it was always a two-party system. I think possibly because there's something in our federalist makeup that just makes it difficult to do the multi-party thing. I don't know. But it's not, I'll be honest, like since Donald Trump happened, it's not been an issue I've thought about a ton. I have an uncle who's really committed to this idea of Something about proportional representation. God damn it! I should really go back and read. I'm not explaining it well, but I mean, there are many smart people who are really committed to the idea of changing certain things, and some of them are very compelling. And I used to be one of those people, but now I'm just a little more wrapped up in, hey, it'd be nice if we killed killed fewer people overseas, that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm not as wrapped up in it as I once was. But yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting question. Like a lot of people would argue that actually the Democrats and the Republicans, despite the fact they've got this inertia of power, actually might be getting a little too weak. The idea that there's just not a lot of discipline left with either of the parties, and the fact that Donald Trump was able to sort of hijack the Republican Party would be an indicator that that may be the case. But yeah, haven't been reading up on that enough recently to actually contribute. I got a super chat, Brando Commando. I disagree. Brando Commando, very generous super chat, says, I disagree. Rioting and vandalism isn't protected under the First Amendment. If the federal government doesn't step in, you'd see private citizens rise up and lead to worse violence. The demand for a stronger response would grow and lead to a more authoritarian leader. I strongly disagree. I don't think that's true. I think that the United States in the 1960s went through a much more serious pattern of insurrection. The inner cities of most large cities burned down in the 1960s, and we survived without these kinds of authoritarian interventions. There was mass terrorism, mass domestic terrorism, to the tune of hundreds of incidents every year in the early 1970s. And you know what? We survived without setting up a national Gestapo. There's a great law school quote. I can't lie. This may be the first time I've referred to something from law school in a positive sense. It's a hard cases make bad law. And the idea that, sure, okay, like maybe you have trouble with rioting and vandalism or whatever, but that should make you more interested in holding on to your principles rather than discarding principles. The First Amendment is a thing. The 10th Amendment is a very important thing that conservatives and libertarians harp on a lot. The 10th Amendment, which gives powers to the states. And so, for the 1960s, we didn't need a Department of Homeland Security Gestapo to deal with things. Then we don't need it now. And also, we definitely don't need it now because there isn't a problem. As I pointed out, this is strictly a Portland-Seattle thing where there's been multi-year problems. It's not like the anarchists in Portland are unopposed. There is a reputed to be fairly right-wing police department that battles with these anarchists. Like, it's being handled. And it is not worth burning up, pissing on the Constitution because there's a little rioting and vandalism. That's a little, yeah. So I would respectfully, because you just gave me $20, Brando Commando, I would disagree with that strongly. And the only reason, again, the only reason these things are happening on a national scale, shockingly, I mean, I was legitimately shocked that we had a nationwide protest movement for like the first time since the Civil Rights Movement. It's because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, I'll do a video on this, but Donald Trump is the most important left-wing president since Lyndon Baines Johnson. The amount of left-leaning stuff that he has pushed forward is extraordinary, completely unintentionally. So yeah, I think the demand for a stronger response, I would flip that around and think like if Donald Trump wasn't president, if Rand Paul was president, or Scott Walker or Chris Christie or any of the 16 Republicans, would any of this be happening? No. So this idea that the Republicans chose a completely inappropriate president, and then the country sort of set on fire, doesn't mean that we should then burn up the Constitution. Yeah, it just doesn't follow for me. Anyway, thank you for the super chat, Brando Commando. I hope I respectfully enough disagreed with you. Brando Commando is very generous, so Maybe he's just devil's advocating. Nikhil Otto asks, COVID-19. Do you think Trump tampering with the CDC data is going to make an impact on the election? The economy is going to get worse anyways. Thoughts on this? It's unlikely the economy will recover soon, but neither will COVID numbers. Okay, so COVID-19's, I don't think that Trump tampering with the CDC data is going to affect the election. It's too complicated a story. I think most people know that Donald Trump has abysmally mismanaged the COVID-19 crisis. It's been a disaster. It's his fault. People know that. But as far as the admittedly very Orwellian, very disturbing fact that he is now, basically because he doesn't want to hear any more reports about COVID-19, he's attempting to cripple the reporting and consolidation stuff. Yeah, that should be. In an ideal world, that would move a lot of votes. But it just seems a little too complicated for me. Donald Trump is sending jackbooted federal thugs into your city. That's a simple narrative. That's a narrative that can cost him votes for sure. But the CDC data, even though it's in many ways more troubling, no, actually I wouldn't say more troubling, but in many ways as troubling. I mean, what Donald Trump has done to the Centers for Disease Control is just appalling. And I don't think people are really wrapping their heads around this enough. A lot of people want to advance these like broad systemic, like, it's because, the US has the worst healthcare response in the world because we don't have socialized medicine like everybody else. And I think there's something to those narratives. There's like aspects of that are worth, paying attention to. But more broadly, the reason we have had such a disastrous response is because Trump actively crushed the Centers for Disease Control and continues to do that. There was a woman at the Centers for Disease Control. She has not been fired because he doesn't want to make that a headline, who was warning, and I think mid-February, about how a pandemic was inevitable and there's going to be large spread in the United States. And she hasn't, people like to talk about, how Deborah Birx and Fauci are being included. And like, she was silenced. She was muzzled. And so much of what's important about what the Centers for Disease Control does is communication. Like, they have to be free to speak about what is happening in the world and in the country with diseases, and they're not. They've been completely muzzled. And so this particular act to wipe out the CDC's COVID information sharing completely is actually less damaging than it would have been, because Trump already did that in February. The Centers for Disease Control was an internationally respected institution before Donald Trump got here. You can argue the degree to which, is it Redfield or whatever, the folks, the guy who's in charge of the CDC, I think he actually was approved by the Senate. You can argue back and forth the degree to which, he is a complete waste of space. But if the guy in charge doesn't want to hear and doesn't want anybody to hear what the CDC has to say, you're going to get a disaster. So I think that's really, and maybe it's a left liberal urge to be like, oh, no, it's the healthcare system in general that sucks, that is keeping people from really, really dialing down on the fact that it's Donald fucking Trump who killed this, who killed the world. Because you got to believe, the US is the main super spreader country at this point. George W. Bush is a president I have a ton of problems with, but he took pandemic response fucking seriously. It's a natural security issue. Republicans should be good at this. And the CDC was in good shape under Clinton and under Bush and under Obama. And Trump just shat all over it. And that's why the world, not just the United States, it's why the world is as fucked as it is. Sorry. And I feel fairly strongly about this. Thoughts on this? So those are my thoughts on the CDC stuff. It's unlikely the economy will recover soon, but neither will COVID numbers. Is you saying that you don't think COVID numbers are going to go up? If so, awesome. That'd be great. But yeah, I have wondered if like there has been like an over assumption that like these big rises in Arizona and Georgia and so Arizona, Texas, and Florida are going to lead to like New York style situations. I don't think they will because once again, as I've been saying for 6 months, cars. But I think maybe a lot of people are assuming that the COVID stuff's going to just keep skyrocketing, being awful. I don't think that's the case. I feel like Logo may be about to rip into me for saying that, but we'll see. Okay, there was another super chat that I missed from Pandemonium Niebuhr. Thank you, super chat. Is the United States going through a second political realignment? As in the never Trump Republicans gaining more power over the Democrats? That's an interesting question, and I fucking hope not. The never Trump Republicans are there are a lot of Republicans who hate Trump, of a wide variety of proclivities, histories. Unfortunately, there's a large component. There's basically a whole bunch of Republicans who very early on, prominent Republicans like David Frum, the guy who wrote the Axis of Evil speech, I think Tom Nichols, Bill Kristol, a guy who has been advocating to murder Middle Easterners. That's basically been his whole job for the past 25 years. A lot of very prominent folks that have become known as never Trump Republicans who didn't hate Trump because he was corrupt or insane or completely inappropriate, though, to differing degrees, maybe. Their main problem with Trump was that he occasionally differed from the foreign policy orthodoxy that says the United States has to be everywhere, invading everywhere all the time. This group, the Never Trump Republicans, it's a completely disparate group of people, large. I wouldn't call myself a Never Trump Republican, but I would certainly consider myself Never Trump. But I think they've been making a fantastic series of videos basically just designed to piss Trump off under the moniker of the Lincoln Project. So I think a lot of them would like to take over the Democratic Party. And I think there's a lot of Democratic Party establishment figures that are kind of open to that. But I don't think the Democratic rank and file, is that the appropriate term? I don't think the sort of Democratic Party member at large is going to be very interested in that or at all interested in that. I just look at what's happening in New York right now with the pro-war Democrats getting primaried and falling out. And unlike Republican sort of primary, Republicans get primaried are usually replaced with, to differing degrees, nut jobs who don't particularly want to do anything. There is what's the word? Sorry, I'm getting texts. There's a consistent, more progressive lean to a lot of these Democrats that are being appointed. This is not to endorse like the Fox News view, like, oh, they're turning into a bunch of commies. But I think in the spectrum of Democrats, which generally is sort of like, a right to far right European party, there are now included more progressive elements. And I do feel that a lot of these never Trump Republican types sort of at the other end are likely to end up less influential than they'd like. I think the Biden might appoint some of these schmucks, and that'd be a pity to some roles. But hopefully not too many, because I think, he's got to, he has to appease the growing left wing of his party as well. So who knows? I think, we will do our damnedest at this channel to make sure that not too many of those folks are appointed in the Biden administration. M. Savina asks, why is your audio not in sync with your talking? I'm sorry. Are other folks having this issue? I feel like, okay, it says it's working fine for some other folks. I am, I bought an Ethernet cable, we are jacked in. We've been going so far more or less without problems for an hour and 20 minutes. At this point, actually, if it does cut off, then it'll be an hour and 20 minutes. It'll be an hour and 20-minute presentation. Okay. Questions. Oh, well, there was another live chat, so I'll just jump down to another super chat. So I'll just jump down to that. Tony Gohagan, a name I can reliably pronounce, Tony Gohagan, asks a question. 10 pounds. Whoa, generous. Do you see larger voter turnout for elections? Number one, absolutely, yes. There's no question that Trump has been very motivating, both for Republicans and Democrats. I anticipate that we will have a large turnout for this election. COVID obviously throws another wrench into things, but I think by hook or by crook, folks are going to get out there and vote. I certainly am. Yeah. There's that. Two, if Trump loses but refuses to accept the result, what political and civil response do you see? I don't think Trump has the balls, frankly. Yeah, I don't think. I think Trump is going to lose, and I think he's going to whine a lot about the result. But I think he's going to be very happy to just sort of go and found a news channel, Trump News or some shit, Trump Media, fake news, whatever. I think he'd be just as happy to get out. Yeah, I don't see that happening. Were it to happen, let's see here. Were it to happen, I think that not just, we wouldn't have to get to the point where the military steps in and makes sure that the election happens or anything like that. I think people in the Trump administration would not let it happen. I think sort of Pence and his cabinet, Pence and Mnuchin, I could see sort of Article 23ing the guy or something. I think it's Article 23 of the Constitution or something. I don't know that for sure. Actually, maybe that's some law. Talks about how, if a president is of diminished capacity, and I would say that attempting to overthrow a U.S. election would be a fair diminished capacity for a president, and that would just allow the vice president and other people in the cabinet to intervene and just boot him out. For the sort of three-month lame duck period. Also, Congress could just impeach him. And I think that would probably happen. Impeach and remove him, which I think would happen. Yeah, so a lot of people are fixated on this idea that Trump's going to do a coup. I think actually what this presentation was sort of on the lack of likelihood of that. This sort of Department of Homeland Security, the sort of internal ministry, Gestapo, secret police system is, he'd like it to exist, but it just doesn't. So I'm just not as concerned about that as many are. Number three, will he deploy militia to quell riots if they erupt? Militia, I'm not sure who you mean so militias, there used to be state militias. My understanding is that that's what became the National Guard. National Guard, despite the fact that they got dragooned to fight in Iraq, those are the folks who should be quelling riots. And National Guards, it's a little shaky. It's a little weird. It used to be the militias for each state, the National Guards for each jurisdiction really were controlled by the governors, but it's a little weirder now. I think there's some overlap between military infrastructure. I remember it's it ain't something the founders would like, but still the National Guard generally, I can't think of any real exceptions, right? Maybe it's Eisenhower and maybe Alabama, where the National Guard generally acts in accordance with the wishes of the governor or is called in by the governor. So yeah. But what, you think he's gonna call up the Oath Keepers and the Michigan militia and the sort of no, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that I don't think that worked out very well. It's interesting because there is a sort of fuzziness between the people who work for these dumbass agencies, these sort of fake law enforcement agencies like ICE and CBP and Border Patrol. These sort of they're real law enforcement agencies. These false military organizations. They do sort of trend into, and a lot of them sort of are cross membership with sort of white supremacist militia. Various armed dipshits. I'm not really particularly concerned about large-scale civic uprising, on the part of Trump-supporting rednecks. I think what we're unfortunately, I keep meaning to do a video on this, what we're probably in for is another Oklahoma City type thing. In the 1990s, there was this massive upwelling in sort of militia movements. It's funny, not portrayed back then as being explicitly white supremacist, but I'm sure there were aspects of that. This sort of our riots, state riots, the Michigan militia was one of the most famous. And it became a very big thing to the point where people were getting pretty worried about it. And then in 1996, a guy named, I don't name mass murderers, some asshole, blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing something like 160 people. And he had been to some degree adjacent to these movements, and those movements just sort of whoop, dried up and blew away. I think that Trump and sort of Democratic folks are overestimating the sort of power of these, overestimating the power and importance of these sort of right-wing, white nationalist militia movements in the United States. Basically, I think they're a bunch of pussies, and I think that that's a not good language. I apologize. It's an inappropriate. Pussies are great. They're beautiful things that create life and what have you. But they're wimps. I think these people are all hat and no cattle. I feel like after the first one of these sort of state hall protests turns into a mass death event, I think we're gonna all of a sudden hear a lot less from those thin blue line assholes. All right, Brando Commando. Off topic, but Egypt's government had a unanimous 20-0 vote on direct military involvement in Libya and will be under the leadership of General Haftar. What are your thoughts, and how do you see this playing out? Apologies for patrons. We discussed this at length in the patron-only live chat a couple weeks back, but I think I don't have, since that chat a couple weeks back, yes, the Egyptian parliament, I think the Egyptian parliament approved the unanimous vote. Yeah, the Egyptian parliament approved a military, under the leadership of General Haftar. That's not something I've seen, but my understanding is that the Egyptian parliament has approved a Egyptian military intervention in Libya to support General Haftar, a guy I don't like. General Haftar is the aspiring strongman of Libya. He essentially invaded the territory of the internationally approved, internationally recognized government of Libya last year. This year, through the intervention of Turkey, he has lost completely. His offensive has petered out. My understanding is that, yeah, there was absolutely the addition of Turkish military technology, some special forces maybe, a lot of Syrian jihadists that work for the Turkish government. That sort of turned the tables, but I think people are underestimating the extent to which this was sort of a handshake, not a handshake, but a deal between Putin and Erdogan, between Russia and Turkey. We'll let Haftar be defeated, mostly because Haftar is getting kind of uppity and pissing off all of his many international supporters. But you're not going to go any further. So I don't think the Turkish-supported, UN-approved, internationally recognized government of Libya is going to invade Haftar's territory in eastern Libya. And I think that my sense, still, even after the parliament has approved an Egyptian military intervention in Libya, is that it probably won't happen. And that even if it does happen, it will conquer